believing they can reach the highest plane of potential destiny because of some innate capacity and capability through their own good works and good deeds. That's the contrast. Jesus is saying, look, there are two roads marked to heaven. One is the narrow, compressed road of divine righteousness. The other is the broad road of human righteousness. You see, the Jews had taught that they could make it on their own. That's why it was so shocking when the Apostle Paul said, by the deeds of the law shall no flesh be justified in God's sight, Romans 3. And Paul said, the law came in order to stop our mouths from any claim to righteousness and to render the whole world guilty before God. The law came to show us our sinfulness. But when self-righteous, ego-centered man saw that he was sinful by the law, he didn't want to face his sinfulness, so he set the law aside, reinvented a new system that accommodated his shortcoming, and then on the basis of the man-made system, affirmed to his own mind that he was righteous. That's human achievement. The Lord's whole thrust in the Sermon on the Mount is to break the back of that kind of a system. To show them that all the way through that system doesn't make it. That their view of everything is wrong. And the whole purpose of the sermon is to bring them to where he began the sermon. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they that mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. In other words, he starts out where he wants to end up. With people who are broken with a beggarly spirit, mourning over their total sinfulness, meek in the face of God and His law, and hungering and thirsting for what they know they don't have but desperately need, the righteousness of God. He wants to bring them right back to where he started. At that brokenness over sin. But the Pharisees never got the message. I mean, you hear the Pharisee in Luke 18 and he prays, I thank thee that I'm not like other men. And he said, I do this and I do this. And all through that prayer, he never expressed one need to God. Never one need, because he never thought he had a need. Because he was so good as he was. And in the corner is the man pounding on his breast saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus said, that man went home justified, not the other one. And Jesus wants to bring mankind to a point where he realizes his utter incapacity to please God in his own flesh. And in desperation with a broken spirit, meek and mourning, he cries out for righteousness from God. The Jews, of course, thought they were righteous. They thought they were on their way to heaven, on their way to the kingdom. But Jesus forces them to rethink and to make a decision. And a choice. It's the same choice every one of us has to make as well. Now, as we come to verses 13 and 14, the choice is crystallized. And by the way, as I said, this is the pinnacle, and the remainder of the chapter just stretches this thought out and illustrates it. And we'll be seeing that in the weeks to come. But from here on, the choice is clear. There are two gates, the wide and the straight. There are two ways, the broad and the narrow. There are two destinations, life and destruction. There are two kinds of travelers, the few and the many. There are two kinds of trees, the good and the corrupt. There are two kinds of fruit, the good and the bad. There are two builders, the wise and the foolish. There are two foundations, the rock and the sand. And there are two houses, and there are two elements to the storm that he discusses. In other words, the clear-cut decision is the whole issue at the climax of this sermon. And I repeat, Jesus does not want bouquets for the ethics, and Jesus does not want postponement of the requirements. What he wants is action. Response. And he forces us to a decision. And people, I don't think, have really understood this passage. And I think when we're done this morning, you will see it in a new way. There are four contrasts I want you to see in these verses. Four contrasts. Number one, two gates. Two gates. Enter in at the narrow gate, for wide is the gate. And then verse 14, because narrow is the gate. Two times he mentions the narrow gate once he mentions the wide gate. 2 gates. Only 2. Both roads, as I said, point to salvation. Both roads point to God. Both roads point to the kingdom. Both roads point to glory. Both roads point to blessing. Both roads point to heaven. Both roads don't go there. One is self-righteousness, and one is divine righteousness. Before you get on the road, you got to go through the gate. So the gate comes first. Now let's look first of all at the narrow gate. And this is basically the crux of the interpretation, so we'll spend a little more time on this. I want to just begin to develop the concept that's involved in this narrow gate. First of all, the first thing I see as I look at verse 13 is, you must enter. You get that? You must enter. There's a sense of urgency here in this aorist imperative. It demands a point of action right now. Do it now. Enter now. This is the time. This is the moment. This is what God is calling for. You must do this. It is not an option. It is a command. An absolute command. Now, the Lord Jesus had been teaching them a very narrow way of life. Their way had all kinds of tolerance for sin. They had all kinds of laws beyond the law of God. They had all kinds of standards beyond the standards of God. They had invented a system that was man-made and far-reaching, and all of these kinds of things were part of their system. And Jesus said, you got to get rid of that, you got to get rid of that, this is what it is, this is what it is, and He narrowed it and narrowed it and narrowed it down until by the time He came to chapter 7, verse 12, He had presented to them a very refined and confined approach to living to the glory of God. And they got the picture that it was a very narrow, prescribed way. And Jesus spoke, they say at the end of the chapter, as one having authority. He didn't drag up all the stuff of the rabbis. He just nailed down the specifics. And so they get the picture. Compared to their system, it was very narrow, very prescribed. And Jesus says, you must enter this narrow way.